the mysterious warrior woman. The village of Mfiwa was known across the land for its fierce warriors, brave hunters, and proud traditions. Men were the protectors, the fighters, the rulers. Women were expected to be gentle, obedient, and silent. But in this village, one woman did not fit that mold. Her name was Nyah. From the moment she could walk, she was different. While the other girls learned to weave and cook, Nyah was climbing trees, lifting heavy stones, and watching the men train with spears. She was lean and strong, her muscles hardened from years of secret training. She did not laugh freely like the other girls. She did not lower her eyes when men spoke. And most of all, she did not allow any man to touch her. At first, the village whispered about her. "She is cursed," the elders muttered. "No woman should behave this way." But the whispers soon turned to fear. It started when a young man named Thibaut, full of arrogance, tried to make Nyah his wife. He approached her one evening after the village feast, smiling with confidence. "You are beautiful," he said. "You should be honored to be chosen by me." Nyah did not respond. She simply looked at him, her dark eyes unreadable. Thibaut reached for her hand, intending to claim her. And that was his mistake. Before he could even blink, Nyah's fist shot forward, striking him hard across the face. The sound of the impact echoed through the village. Thibaut stumbled back, blood dripping from his nose. The onlookers gasped. No woman had ever laid a hand on a man like that before. Thibaut, humiliated, roared with anger. He lunged at her, ready to put her in her place. But Nyah was faster. She sidestepped his attack and swept his legs out from under him, sending him crashing to the ground. This time, no one gasped. No one spoke. They only stared in shock. That night, the whispers spread like wildfire. "She is not just strong," they said, "she is dangerous." The men who tried. Thibaut was only the first. Many men, believing themselves to be stronger, tried to tame Nyah. Some came with flattering words. Others came with gifts. Some, like Thibaut, came with force. But they all left bruised and broken. Nyah fought with precision, speed, and ruthless efficiency. She did not fight like a man. She fought like something else entirely, something they did not understand. The men began to fear her. "Stay away from her," they whispered to one another. "She is not a woman, she is a demon in disguise." But despite the fear, there were still those who could not resist the challenge. One day, a wealthy suitor from another village arrived. His name was Kofi, and he was not like the others. "I have heard of you," Kofi said to Nyah, standing tall. "You fight well. But strength is not for women." Nyah met his gaze, her face unreadable. Kofi smiled, thinking he had won her attention. "I will give you many gifts," he continued. "Gold, fine cloth, whatever you desire. All you must do is be my wife." The village watched in silence, waiting for Nyah's response. She did not speak. Instead, she stepped forward. Without warning, she grabbed Kofi's wrist and twisted it sharply. He gasped in pain. "You think strength is only for men," Nyah said, her voice low and steady. "Then let me show you my strength." And with that, she threw him to the ground. The watching crowd erupted into murmurs. Kofi, who had been so sure of himself, now lay flat on his back, staring at the sky in shock and shame. Nyah stepped over him, her voice cutting through the noise. "A woman does not need a man to give her strength," she said. "She already has it." The village never forgot those words. From that day, no man dared to try and claim Nyah as his wife. But though they feared her, they did not understand her. And so, the whispers continued. "She must be cursed. She hates men. She fights as if she is protecting something. But no one knew what that something was. Not yet. The challenge of the warriors. The village of Mfiwa could not ignore Nyah's strength any longer. She had defeated every man who dared to challenge her, and now the whispers had turned into worries. She fights like a warrior, some said. She has no respect for men, others muttered. But the elders were the most concerned. If no man can defeat her, they said gravely, what does that mean for the balance of our village? They feared that Nyah's defiance would inspire other women to rebel, and that was something they could not allow. So, they made a decision. Nyah must be tested. The elders' decision. One morning, Nyah was summoned to the village square. Everyone gathered to see what would happen. Men, women, children, they all whispered among themselves as Nyah approached, her expression unreadable. At the center of the square stood the village chief, surrounded by 5 of the strongest warriors. You have shamed our men, the chief said, his deep voice echoing across the square. You act as if you are stronger than them. But strength is not for women. Nyah said nothing. The chief raised his hand and gestured toward the warriors. These are our finest fighters, he said. If you can defeat them all, then you may continue your ways. But if you lose, you will bow before our traditions. You will submit, as a woman should. The crowd held its breath. Everyone knew these warriors were no ordinary men. They were hunters, men who had killed lions with their bare hands. Surely, Nyah could not defeat them all. Could she? Nyah studied the warriors. Their arms were thick with muscle. Their eyes gleamed with confidence. But they were also arrogant. That would be their weakness. Nyah met the chief's gaze. I accept, she said simply. The first warrior. The first man, Django, stepped forward. He was tall and quick, known for his speed in battle. Django lunged at Nyah, aiming to tackle her to the ground. But Nyah was faster. She ducked, sidestepped, and struck him hard in the ribs. Django gasped, stumbling back. He was not used to pain, not like Nyah was. Before he could recover, Nyah swept his legs from under him. Django hit the ground hard. The crowd gasped. The first warrior had fallen. The second and third warriors. The next 2 warriors attacked together. They believed that if they overwhelmed Nyah, they could break her. But Nyah had spent years fighting, not just with her fist, but with her mind. She used their strength against them, dodging their blows and striking at their weak points. One man fell with a bruised throat, struggling to breathe. The other landed face first in the dirt, too weak to continue. The crowd was no longer whispering. They were silent. The 4th warrior. The 4th warrior, Boko, was the strongest of them all. His fists were like hammers, and he fought with fury. He roared as he charged at Nyah, swinging wildly. But Nyah did not fight wildly. She fought with precision. She waited, dodging his heavy blows. She let him tire himself out. Then, with one perfect strike, she hit him in the side of the neck, cutting off his ear. Boko dropped to his knees, gasping. He could no longer fight. The final warrior. The last warrior was different. He did not rush. He did not underestimate Nyah. His name was Zubri, and he had been watching her fight. You are skilled, he admitted. But I am not like the others. Nyah studied him. For the first time, she felt a flicker of uncertainty. Zubri moved with patience. He did not make the same mistakes as the others. They fought for longer than any of the other matches. Nyah had to push herself harder than ever before. But in the end, she won. With a final, brutal strike to his ribs, Zubri collapsed. The village's reaction. He laughed. You truly are remarkable, he said, nodding. Prince Azaro, still lying on the ground, glared. The king turned back to Nyah. I offer you a place in my royal army, he said. You will be my greatest warrior. The crowd cheered. But Nyah did not smile. She did not bow. Instead, she lifted her chin and said, I do not fight for kings. The king's smile faded. You dare refuse me, he asked, his voice turning cold. I fight for my own freedom, Nyah said. Not to serve another man. A heavy silence filled the room. No one had ever dared to refuse the king before. No one. The betrayal. Prince Azaro rose to his feet, his fist clenched. You insult my father, he said. You insult our kingdom. He turned to the king. She must be punished. The king's expression hardened. Nyah, he said, you are no longer welcome in my lands. The guard stepped forward, ready to seize her. But Nyah was already moving. With lightning speed, she disarmed one of the warriors and escaped. She ran through the palace, dodging guards, scaling walls, and disappearing into the night. By the time the king gave the order to hunt her down, she was already gone. But the king was not finished. She will not get away with this, he vowed. Prepare the army. We will crush her village. And so, because Nyah refused to bow, the king's wrath would fall upon Fiwa. And the battle for her true freedom was only beginning. The prince's temptation. Nyah ran through the dark forest, her breath steady despite the chase. Behind her, the king's guards searched the night, torches flickering like angry fireflies. But they would not catch her. She had survived worse. She had escaped men before. And she would do it again. By the time the first rays of sunlight pierced the sky, Nyah was already far from the palace, moving toward home. But home was no longer safe. She had humiliated the king. And now, Mfiwa would pay the price. The threat to Mfiwa. By the time she reached the outskirts of her village, the elders were already gathered, their faces lined with fear. A messenger had arrived before her. The king had declared that at sunrise, his army would march on Mfiwa. If Nyah did not surrender, the village would be burned to the ground. The chief turned to her, his face grim. You have brought war upon us, he said. Nyah met his gaze, her voice calm. I will fight for this village, she said. I will not let them destroy it. But the elders were afraid. Nyah, this is the king's army. You are strong, but you cannot win this fight alone. Nyah said nothing. Because she knew they were right. She had spent her whole life fighting alone. But this was bigger than her. For the first time, she needed more than just her own strength. She needed a plan. And before she could make one, Prince Azaro arrived. No one spoke. No one moved. Nyah, breathing heavily, stood alone in the center of the square. She had defeated them all. She had won. But instead of cheering, the village only stared at her in fear. No woman was meant to be this strong. No woman was meant to be stronger than men. The chief's face was dark with anger. This is unnatural, he muttered. Then, he turned to the elders. There must be a reason for this, he said. We must know the truth. The truth begins to unfold. That night, the village elders gathered. And an old woman, Mama Akua, stepped forward. I know why she fights, she said. I know the truth about Nyah. And for the first time, the village would hear the story of her past. The story of pain, loss, and survival. The story of why Nyah would never submit. The shadows of her past. The village of Mfiwa had never been so silent. Night had fallen, and the elders had gathered around a roaring fire. The villagers sat behind them, waiting. Even the warriors who had lost to Nyah were there, their bruised faces barely visible in the flickering flames. At the center of it all stood Mama Akua, the oldest woman in the village. Her back was bent with age, but her voice was still strong. "I know why she fights," she said. The crowd leaned in. Nyah stood with her arms crossed, her face unreadable. But deep inside, she knew that her past was about to be uncovered. And once it was spoken, there would be no turning back. The pain of the past. Nyah was not always strong, Mama Akua began. She was once a small, helpless girl. A girl who had everything taken from her. The villagers listened closely. Nyah stared into the flames, her jaw tight. "My father," she said suddenly, her voice cold, "was a monster." A murmur swept through the crowd. Nyah did not flinch. She would not hide from the truth. "He was a man who believed that a woman's place was beneath him," she continued. "That a woman's voice did not matter. That a woman's pain was meaningless." Her fingers clenched into fists. "My mother suffered at his hands. Every day, she endured his rage. Every day, she begged for mercy. But no one helped her. No one stopped him." Tears welled in the eyes of some women in the crowd. Because they understood. Many of them had lived in the same kind of silence. One night, Nyah said, her voice growing softer, she could not endure it anymore. The villagers held their breath. She was pregnant. "My father," he was angry over something small. He beat her harder than usual. She fell to the ground, screaming in pain. A tear slipped down Nyah's cheek, but she did not wipe it away. "I was only a child." I ran to her side, trying to wake her. But she was already gone. The fire crackled. The village remained silent. A childhood stolen. But it did not end there, Nyah continued. The villagers shifted uneasily. They had already heard more than they ever wanted to know. But there was more. After my father died, I was sent to live with my uncles. For the first time, Nyah laughed, but there was no joy in the sound. They were worse. More gasps from the villagers. They were men who treated women as objects. They took whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted. They had no shame. No honor. She turned, looking at the women in the crowd. "You know the kind of men I speak of." Some of them nodded. Others lowered their heads in shame and fear. Their wives lived in fear. They never spoke. Never fought back. They just endured. Nyah's voice hardened. "I watched it all. And I decided I would never be like them. I would never be weak. I would never allow a man to control me." She turned to the warriors she had defeated. "That is why I fight." The men lowered their eyes. The village reacts. The silence stretched long and heavy. The chief, who had once believed that Nyah was nothing but a rebellious woman, now looked at her with something different in his eyes. Not fear. Not anger. But understanding. The women of the village, who had once whispered about Nyah's defiance, now saw her differently. She had fought for herself. She had fought for them. One woman, a young mother with bruises on her arms, stood up. "Nyah," she said softly, "you are not alone." Another woman stood. Then another. And another. One by one, the women of the village rose to their feet. For the first time, they were not silent. For the first time, they were seen. The men looked around, uneasy. They had always assumed that women accepted their place. That women had no choice. But Nyah had shown them otherwise. And now, things would never be the same. The chief's verdict. The village chief exhaled deeply. He had called for Nyah to be humbled. To be put in her place. Instead, he had learned a lesson himself. He turned to Nyah. "You have suffered greatly," he said. Nyah said nothing. You have fought not out of hatred, but out of survival. Still, she did not speak. The chief looked at the crowd, at the standing women, at the shameful faces of the men. He knew that the village had already changed. No decree could undo it. And so, he nodded. You may continue to fight, he said. You may live as you wish. No man will force you into marriage. No man will lay a hand on you. The villagers gasped. This was not what they expected. But the women smiled. Nyah, however, did not celebrate. She only nodded once. The battle was far from over. But for the first time in her life, she had won something that could not be taken away. Her freedom. The king's command. News of Nyah's victory spread far beyond the village of Mfiwa. Travelers carried stories of a woman warrior who had defeated every man who dared to challenge her. A woman who had fought against tradition and won. It was only a matter of time before the great king of the land heard these whispers. And when he did, he was not pleased. The king's summons. One morning, the village chief received an unexpected visitor, a royal messenger, draped in golden cloth, his spear gleaming under the sun. He stood before the people of Mfiwa and declared, the king summons the warrior woman called Nyah. The villagers froze. No one refused the summons from the king. The chief turned to Nyah, his expression unreadable. You must go, he said. Nyah did not hesitate. If the king wanted to see her, then she would face him, just as she had faced every other man who had tried to control her. She would not bow. She would not break. The journey to the palace. The journey was long, taking Nyah through dense forest, across raging rivers, and over vast plains. But she did not tire. She did not fear. By the time they reached the royal city, she was ready. The palace was unlike anything she had ever seen, tall stone walls, golden rooftops, and warriors in polished armor guarding every entrance. But Nyah did not falter. She walked through the grand gates with her head held high, refusing to be intimidated. The king was waiting. The king's test. The king sat upon his massive golden throne, his robes heavy with jewels. His eyes were sharp, filled with power and pride. Beside him stood his only son, Prince Azero. A warrior. A hunter. A man who did not believe that a woman could ever be his equal. The king leaned forward. I have heard the stories, he said. A woman who defeats men in combat. A woman who refuses to bow. Nyah said nothing. The king's lips curled. If you are truly as strong as they say, he continued, then prove it. He gestured to the warriors lined up before him, his personal guards, the best fighters in the kingdom. If you defeat them, the king said, I will grant you a place of honor. Prince Azaros nodded. She will not last one fight, he said. A woman does not belong on a battlefield. Nyah turned to him, her dark eyes steady. I have already defeated many men like you, she said. You are not special. The crowd gasped. Prince Azaros' face darkened. Let the fights begin, the king ordered. The battle in the palace. One by one, the royal warriors stepped forward. Each was stronger, faster, and more skilled than the men of Mfiwa. But Nyah was prepared. She fought with precision, striking weak points, dodging attacks, using her opponent's own strength against them. The first warrior fell quickly, clutching his ribs. The second warrior tried to grab her, but she twisted free and sent him crashing to the ground. The third warrior was fast, but she was faster. One by one, they fell. Until only one remained. Prince Azaro. The prince's challenge. Azaro stepped forward, his muscles tense, his hands curled into fists. I will not be like the others, he growled. Nyah smirked. You will fall just like them. The fight began, and it was unlike any Nyah had faced before. Azaro was skilled. He was smart. And he was angry. For the first time, Nyah felt pushed to her limit. They exchanged blow after blow, neither one backing down. The crowd was silent, watching in awe as the two warriors clashed. But in the end, Nyah won. She dodged his final strike and delivered a powerful kick to his chest, sending him crashing to the ground. Prince Azaro did not move. The palace erupted in shock. A woman had defeated the prince of the kingdom. And there was no denying it. The king's reaction. The king stood, his face unreadable. Then, he did something no one expected. The prince's offer. The village tensed as Prince Azaro rode into Mfiwa, flanked by a handful of his personal guards. He looked different now. Less arrogant. More curious. He dismounted his horse and walked toward Nyah, his bruised face still carrying the marks of their battle. Nyah, he said, his voice steady. You have made a powerful enemy. Nyah crossed her arms. I have made many enemies, she replied. Azaro smirked. Yes, he said. But none like my father. He glanced at the villagers, his expression unreadable. I am here to offer you a way out, he said. Nyah narrowed her eyes. And what is that? Azaro took a slow step forward. Marry me, he said. The village erupted in shocked whispers. Nyah stared at him. She had been challenged before. She had been threatened before. But she had never been tempted like this. The prince's plan. If you become my wife, Azaro continued, I can protect you. My father will not harm his own son's village. Nyah's fist clenched. And what do you get in return? She asked. Azaro held her gaze. The strongest woman in the kingdom by my side, he said. Nyah laughed, but there was no humor in it. I see now, she said. You do not come with a gift. You come with a cage. Azaro exhaled. This is not a trick, Nyah, he said. If you refuse, the king will send his army. Your people will suffer. The chief nodded. He is right, Nyah, he said. We cannot win this war. But Nyah's mind was already racing. She would not bow to any man. She would not give up her freedom. But she could not let Mfiwa be destroyed. There had to be another way. And suddenly, she saw it. She turned back to Azaro, her expression cold and sharp as a blade. I will not marry you, she said. But I will make you an offer instead. Azaro frowned. What offer? Nyah smiled. The chance to stand on the right side of history. A dangerous alliance. That night, Nyah sat across from Azaro in the village chief's hut. The villagers remained outside, whispering about what this meeting could mean. Azaro folded his arms. I hope you are not asking me to betray my father, he said. Nyah leaned forward. You already know that your father is wrong, she said. You saw it when I defeated you. When I defeated your best warriors. Strength is not just for men. Azaro said nothing. Nyah watched him carefully. Your father is an old man ruling in an old way, she continued. But you are the future. Azaro's jaw clenched. I am his son, he said. You are also his heir, Nyah said. And one day, you will have to decide what kind of king you will be. Azaro stared at her. A long silence stretched between them. Then, finally, he exhaled. What are you proposing? Nyah leaned back, her eyes gleaming. A battle, she said. Azaro frowned. You cannot win against the king's army, he said. Nyah smiled. I do not need to win, she said. I just need to show the people that they have a choice. Azaro's eyes darkened. You want to turn the army against my father? Nyah nodded. If the warriors see me fight, and if they see you standing beside me, they will question everything they have been taught. She looked him in the eye. They will see a new way. A better way. Azaro was silent for a long time. Finally, he let out a slow breath. And then, to Nyah's surprise, he smiled. You truly are dangerous, he said. Nyah smirked. So they tell me. Azaro stood. Very well, he said. I will ride with you into battle. Nyah rose as well. For the first time in her life, she was not fighting alone. The battle from Fiwa had just begun. The betrayal and the battle. The sun rose over Mfiwa, bathing the village in golden light. But this was not a morning of peace. It was the morning of war. Beyond the hills, the king's army was marching toward them, hundreds of warriors, armored and armed, ready to burn the village to the ground. But Mfiwa was not unprepared. For the first time in its history, the women stood beside the men, weapons in hand, ready to fight for their home. And at the front of them all stood Nyah and Prince Azaro. The king's arrival. The sound of marching feet echoed through the air. Then, from the dust of the road, the king's army appeared. At the front rode the king himself, his face dark with rage. Beside him was his general, a man who had never known defeat. The king raised his hand, and the army halted. Nyah, the king called out, his voice thundering across the land. You were given a choice, and you have made the wrong one. Nyah stepped forward, unshaken. The only wrong choice, she said, is bowing to a tyrant. The villagers behind her shouted in agreement. The king's eyes flicked to Azaro, standing at her side. And you, he said, his voice laced with betrayal. My own son, standing with a woman against your own blood. Azaro did not flinch. My blood is not my loyalty, he said. I stand with what is right. The king's jaw tightened. If you stand against me, he growled, you are no longer my son. Azaro's face remained cold. Then I am free. The king's anger exploded. Burn the village, he commanded. Kill them all. And with that, the battle began, the battle from Fiwa. The king's army charged, weapons gleaming in the morning light. But Mfiwa was ready. The warriors, the hunters, and even the women and children fought back with everything they had. Spears clashed. Swords sang. Dust and blood filled the air. Nyah moved like a shadow, dodging blows and striking with precision. Beside her, Azaro fought like a man with nothing to lose, because he had already lost everything. And then, something unexpected happened. The warriors of the king's army, the very men sent to destroy Mfiwa, hesitated. They had never fought against women who refused to submit. They had never seen a prince fighting against his own father. Doubt crept into their minds. For the first time, they questioned the king's rule. And then, one by one, the warriors began to lower their weapons. They began to turn against their own king. The king saw what was happening, and his rage turned to fear. He had already lost the battle. And now, he was losing his kingdom. The fall of the king. The king fought desperately, refusing to surrender. He lashed out at his own men, roaring for them to obey him. But it was too late. His army had already begun to crumble. Then, in the chaos, Nyah and Azaro stood before him. The king glared at them, breathing heavily. You think you have won, he spat. Azaro stepped forward, his sword in hand. You ruled with fear, he said. But fear is not power. Nyah raised her voice. This kingdom belongs to its people, not to a man who believes himself above them. The king laughed bitterly. You think you can change the way the world works, he sneered. Nyah's eyes burned with fire. I already have. The king charged, His sword raised. But before he could strike, Azaro stepped in front of Nyah. With one swift motion, he disarmed his father. The king fell to his knees, defeated. The war was over. A new future. The sun was setting now, casting a warm glow over Mfiwa. The village still stood. The people still stood. And for the first time in history, they were free. Azaro turned to the remaining warriors of the king's army. "You have seen the truth," he said. "Now, you must choose, do you stand with a fallen king, or with a new future?" The warriors knelt. "We stand with you." Azaro turned to Nyah. "You were right," he admitted. "Strength does not belong to men alone." Nyah nodded. "It never did." The village cheered, voices rising into the night. But as they celebrated, Azaro turned back to Nyah. And in his eyes was a question. A question only she could answer. A new future. The battle was over. The king's rule had fallen, his army had surrendered, and the village of Mfiwa still stood. The people had fought for their freedom, and they had won. But now came the true challenge, building a new future. And for the first time, everyone would have a say in what that future looked like. The fate of the king. The defeated king sat in the dust, his once mighty warriors kneeling before Azaro. His face was unreadable, whether from rage or grief, no one could tell. Azaro stepped forward. "You ruled through fear," he said. "And today, that fear died." The king's jaw tightened. "And what will you do now?" he sneered. "Kill me and take my throne." Azaro shook his head. "No," he said. "I am not you." The king's eyes narrowed. "I will not rule by force," Azaro continued. "I will let the people decide what happens next." A murmur swept through the crowd. A king had never given power to the people before. But today was a day of change. A kingdom transformed. For the first time, the people of the great kingdom were asked what they wanted. And what they wanted was freedom. They wanted a ruler who would listen. A ruler who understood that strength was not just muscle, but wisdom, fairness, and respect. And so, the people chose Azaro as their new king, not because of his blood, but because of his growth. Azaro accepted, but with one condition. He would not rule alone. For the first time in history, a council of men and women would lead together. The old ways were gone. The new world had begun. And standing at the heart of this change was Nyah. Nyah's choice. As the village celebrated, Azaro turned to Nyah. "You have done more for this land than anyone," he said. "Stay with me. Rule beside me." The people cheered. They had once feared Nyah. Now, they saw her as a symbol of strength and justice. But Nyah's heart was heavy. She had spent her life fighting for freedom. Could she now live within a palace, surrounded by walls? She looked at Azaro, the prince who had once mocked her but had now become her greatest ally. "I did not fight for a throne," she said. "I fought so that no one would be ruled against their will." Azaro's face softened. "And what do you want?" he asked. Nyah exhaled slowly. "I want to see the world," she said. "To teach others what I have learned. To show women everywhere that they are not powerless." The village fell silent. Azaro nodded. "You are the strongest person I have ever met," he said. Nyah smiled. "I know." The crowd laughed, and even Azaro chuckled. And so, under the golden light of the setting sun, Nyah made her choice. She would not stay. She would not be a queen. She would be a legend. The legend of Nyah. Years passed, and the story of Nyah spread far and wide. Songs were sung of the woman who defeated warriors. Stories were told of the warrior who never bowed. But more than that, women across the land began to rise. They trained. They fought back. They demanded respect. Nyah had not just won a battle. She had changed the world. And though she was no longer in Fiwa, her name would never be forgotten. Because Nyah was more than a warrior. She was more than a woman. She was the unbreakable one. And her legend would live on forever.